come to Ritual 3, and we're pressing on with the learning. We're trying to shift ourselves from an educational structure that presupposes a great deal to inhabiting a questing mode of learning which has no presuppositions whatsoever. This is an ancient technique, and it's a technique that is particularly useful in our time and in our future. Instruction in formed intellectual structures are only good for traditional societies. They, in fact, inhibit and impair. They create more flaws than helps. In times of great transition, in times of expansion, and in the modern transform of human beings and human life. And so we're exploring something that is new and is largely unknown. We're going to talk a little bit about the 1620s today, just for a moment, because it was so formative, both for China and for the American Indians and for Europe. It's incredible for us to realize how resonant certain waves of historical happening are concomitant. For instance, when Lao Tzu and Confucius were teaching in China, Pythagoras was teaching in Greece, and the Buddha was teaching in India. And so you had all at the same time, as if they were resonances of some set, a wave of genius. And in the 1620s, we had a very similar situation in the world. We're looking at this from the context of ritual, and we're trying to learn that ritual action is the selective comportment that establishes all of the sequences upon which our lives are founded. It is the body and the body politic. It is the body social. It is the ground. It's the original objectivity. It's the base upon which all traction for forms and for continued life and continued activity depend. And we've looked at ritual in a set of 3. The sets are each 4 presentations long, 1 month, so that the 3 sets together make 3 months, make a season. And we've seen how the ritual season follows the nature season. We had 3 months, 3 sets of 4, making 12 presentations in nature, and now we're doing the same for ritual. And next we'll do it for myth. And then we'll conclude the year by doing the same thing, the same approach, a method but not a methodology for symbols. And we'll see that that ecology of nature, ritual, myth, and symbol is the primordial DNA, the ecology of the way in which all life has founded itself, not just our lives, but animals, plants, bacteria, even inorganic minerals seem to follow in this kind of a pattern. One of the conceits of alchemy was that even metals evolve in the earth, and that the most sophisticated symbolic metal, gold, was the final state of the development of the symbolism in the metallic element universe. So all life and all inorganic matter even. So that one could say that ritual has in its form the establishment of sequences by which existence becomes stable, becomes firm, is objective. So that ritual is all about objectivity. It's about, in our kind, it's about selecting sequences so that that objectivity, that existence is tailored, is shaped, is, as we will see with the Navajo, we're taking the Navajo sand paintings, medicine men sand paintings, and we're taking the Analects of Confucius, American Indians, Chinese, together as a pair. And we're beginning our survey of learning about ritual by taking these two examples, these two exemplars. What's interesting for us is the way in which they cross-index. And their cross-index goes back tens of thousands of years, but especially for the last 4,000 years, there has been a great, interesting development. When you look at the Analects of Confucius, about 10% of the Analects of Confucius are drawn not from the sayings of Confucius, but from a book of ritual, the Li Qi. So that the Analects of Confucius were tailored so that ritual was, in fact, the central concern of the formulation of Chinese civilization. When we look at Book 2 of the Analects right away, it reads like this in translation. The master said, the practice of government by means of virtue may be compared with the pole star, that's Polaris, which the multitudinous stars pay homage to while it stays in its place. Heaven's order is that it is centered around the pole star which maintains itself. And of course, we know with modern astronomy that Polaris has not always been the pole star. In fact, that the celestial North Pole migrates across the stars. And that tens of thousands of years ago, there was a different pole star. And 100,000 years ago, a different one. And in fact, if we're accurate, Polaris is not there at the axis. It's out in what appears to be empty space until you use something like the Hubble telescope and you see that there are galaxies like the grains of plywood in what seem to be blank space. The master said the practice of government by means of virtue may be compared with a pole star, which the multitudinous stars pay homage to while it stays in its place. The master said, the songs, the book of songs, the book of odes, number 300, but I will cover their meaning with a single quotation. Let there be no depravity in your thoughts. The master said, if you lead them by means of government and keep order among them by means of punishments, the people are without conscience in evading them. If you lead them by means of virtue and keep order among them by means of ritual, they have a conscience, and moreover, they will submit. When we look at some of the rare scholarly writings on the Navajo religion, the origins of the chants, of the sand paintings, Phyllis Ackerman writes, Amerindian religions in general and the Navajo religion in particular are phases of the great polaric cult, which originated in West Asia, probably in the highlands of Eastern Asia Minor and Northwest Iran. Within the next in the 4th millennium BC, and it developed a complex systematic cosmology within the next 4 or 5 centuries, and with the migrations of the metallurgists who adopted this as their craft religion spread across Asia on one hand, and on the other over a considerable part of Europe. The system was based on the observation that the North Star is fixed, and goes on from there. This whole quality of the fixed heavens, a celestial cosmology that endorses a ritual comportment in our lives on earth. That ritual is the correct means of adjusting oneself to the order of the universe. And that the social order must be in accord with the universe's order. That the earth is obviously in accord with heaven's order. And therefore, nature has an order which it must maintain. And human life has an order which it must maintain. And so it's like a core of controlled orders that do not change, they do not refine, they do not grow, they do not improve. It's always a sense of readjusting to get back to, in the Chinese classics, one of the documents is called the doctrine of the mean, to get back to the mean. That the proportions, the rules, the codes, the laws, all are meant to bring everything back so that it keeps fitting into what is known, what is understood, and that this is tradition. In both the Chinese and Navajo worlds, their sense of tradition was unchanging for millennia. When we look at something like Confucius's Analects of Confucius, we are able to see he died in 479 BC. He died about the time that Socrates was born. But there's no use of his material for almost 100 years. Not his disciples, but the disciples of the disciples, the grandsons of the Confucian heritage, were the ones who began to sort it out and try to make systems, try to make schools. In Chinese they're called jie. And at the time, the period from about 350 BC until about the time of, say, 200 BC, that time period is known as, in Chinese thought, as the period of 100 schools. But there were 3 basic schools that developed. One of them was from an engineering mentality man named Su Yan. He developed the yin-yang jie. And out of this came the ritual comportment of understanding everything in terms of yin-yang. The seasons, the heavens, Tao, everything in terms of yin-yang. And so it was put through a ritual sieve. Another school, even more strongly assertive, was that of the legalists. Everything must be according to the established laws, which have been established because they work and because this is the way things should be. And so the legalists, the Mozi people, were very, very powerful. But the most powerful was the school of Mencius. Mencius lived from 371 to 289 BC. And he's the one who completes the 4 books. The 4 books as the core of the Confucian classics. The Analects of Confucius, the Doctrine of the Mean, the Great Learning, and then the Book of Mencius. And one finds, when one comes here to Mencius, he writes in Book 2, Mencius said, "Heaven's favorable weather is less important than Earth's advantageous terrain. And Earth's advantageous terrain is less important than human unity. It is said, it is not by boundaries that the people are confined. It is not by difficult terrain that a state is rendered secure. It is not by superiority of arms that the empire is kept in awe." Then he goes on to assert that keeping ritual is the way. Now, the concern of having the correct shape and the correct boundaries, the correct definitions, is a logical concern. But ritual does not deal with logic. It's not concerned with the shape and the bounds. It's concerned with a permeating structure that is distributed through the entire activity. So instead of coloring the outside shape of bounds, like logic or definition would do, ritual covers the entire fabric. Not covers the fabric, but makes the fabric in the first place. So that to the ritual comportment, the social fabric is the objectivity. And the laws, the codes, the principles, the doctrines only serve to instruct people as to how this really is, how it works, and you should do likewise. It's very important for us, and the title of today's presentation, Sequence Establishes and Dynamic Vectors Generate Narrative. It's the development of the not necessarily bounded quality of shape, of geometry, not needing to have the bounds clearly defined, but only to be able to operate and participate cooperatively with the field. That leads to an interesting development. And the development is this, that the original ritual favors squares or favors circles. But as it goes on in its own course, two things happen at the same time. One is a natural regression that makes it more and more selective, more and more limiting, more and more narrow, so that the rituals become brittle and fragile and tend to make a difficulty for life to continue. And so as a natural balance concomitant to it, what comes out of this is that the squares become dynamic in order to get off the stuck foundation. And as the squares become dynamic, they change to parallelograms. As the circles become dynamic, they stop just being circular and they start to be spirals. Now, the parallelogram is very interesting because the parallelogram allows for a transform naturally. When you have a square, the diameter of the square is always fixed and always the same, and it is dependent for its size, for its purpose, for its existence on the square. The diameter of a square is dependent on the square. But when you have a parallelogram, you have a different geometry that suddenly is naturally available, because the diameter of a parallelogram is not so much a line which is fixed, but it tends to be a vector which is dynamic and is able to operate in a field without reference to boundaries for its ability to correlate. The whole development of vector analysis in mathematics is all taken fundamentally, basically, from the parallelogram and developing it from there. Because not only is this diameter a dynamic vector then, it also correlates two other vectors together. Any two sides of that parallelogram will have a correspondent quality to the vector, and one will be able to develop several different things at the same time. One of the first things that occurs to you is that triangles become very interesting. Whereas in the square, the diameter would make out of the square two triangles, a perfect mirror pair of right triangles. In a parallelogram, depending on the vector dynamic, how great the dynamic is, how far it's going, the two correlate vectors will also then change, not in terms of the boundary or the shape, but just in terms of the energy poured into the vector. Its direction can be anywhere. Its size can be anywhere. Its amplitude can be anything. But the correlates will hold, not in terms of boundedness or shape, but simply in terms of the activity dynamically in the field. And whatever that vector is, all of its correlates, and there are many that can be developed, different pairs of triangles now, isosceles or other styles come into play, and one develops a whole sense of a transforming of the plane of geometricity. This happens without very much knowledge of mathematics. It happens as a matter of course. One of the difficulties in China is that the standard square of things, when it began to develop a dynamic with Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, that dynamic was seen as a revolutionary recapture of the origins of Chinese civilization all the way back to Fuxi. That instead of Fuxi's trigrams being some kind of a universally static, ordered 8, now the square became dynamic, the parallelogram became interesting in that the centers of the two columns, the centers of the Tao and the Te, were seen to be able to exchange with each other, and by exchanging with each other, not to diminish their original development. And so you had transformation that became a part of this kind of dynamic vectoring, and it changed the way in which the narrative language of Chinese was spoken for the very first time. Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching establishes a new kind of Chinese language. A language which is not any longer concerned with merely description, with tradition, with the rhetorical tropes that had been established by that time for over 2,500 years in primitive written Chinese characters. All of a sudden, the Chinese language, the Chinese characters, became a dynamic language capable of expressing transforms that involved not the squares, but the parallelograms, involved the dynamic vector freedom, and one no longer had to look at boundaries, and so one could operate within the open Tao for the first time, and operate with all of the principles of correlation holding. so that one no longer had to compute by the square, one could explore by the parallelogram. And so Chinese as a language changed, and it changed around 520, 510 BC. The brilliant young man at the time was Confucius, Confucius. Absolutely staggering intellect. He was a tall man. He was about 6'5". He was an extraordinary figure. He was a soft-spoken intellectual genius giant. And so he was one of the most conspicuous men in all of Chinese history. He was the first to understand what Lao Tzu had done with the Tao Te Ching. And so when you look at the Tao Te Ching, even though it has two sections, Tao and Te, they are not sections of a square. They are pairs within a dynamic parallelogram of language achieving a new capacity to generate not a ritual which is bounded, but a ritual comportment, an action of existence which is at home in freedom. And when you read the Tao Te Ching, and I just finished polishing my translation I've worked on for 40 years, in the Tao Te Ching, as one gets deeper and deeper into the second part, into Te, what occurs again and again in Lao Tzu is what he calls spirit gen. The spirit human-heartedness changes. Instead of being comfortable and secure by staying within the traditional shapes, within the ritual bounds, and by obeying the reference of these ritual bounds that are all integrated together in a superior ideology, in an idea that now has become permanent as a doctrine, that human nature now is more precisely at home in freedom than in doctrine. And so Confucius, understanding this, you find for the very first time in Confucian Chinese language an elaboration of what he had discovered that Lao Tzu had done. Lao Tzu is the pioneer, Confucius is the settler. And he devotes his whole concern to a program of re-establishing Chinese civilization on the basis of universal freedom and understanding, and that the tradition that will come out of that will be different. It will be founded on Lao Tzu's way. But Lao Tzu's way is not something which is existentially limited. It's an unlimited openness. So that what becomes formed is human ritual, human activity, but that form is like a frame that's laid on complete openness. And the person who is able to utilize that frame, allow that frame to be used as both a tool and as a refining tool, as a sculptor's knife as well as the conductor's baton, that the frame of ritual now is not to keep us within bounds, but to give us a frame which is portable and movable. I remember once one of my friends in San Francisco in the 60s, Emmett Grogan, who was the founder of the Diggers. He was a camera assistant to Antonioni. And he said, one of the great filmmakers of all time. And he said Antonioni used to carry a 35 millimeter frame with him that was empty. And he was constantly holding this up all the time to get his sense of framing shots, of keeping alive in himself the instant quality of being able to see what this would be when it's on screen, what this is going to be in the camera, but not to limit it to a composition frame. Antonioni's style is extremely dynamic. He is after how it is that the sequence of the frames discloses the pivot of the action which reveals the meaning. And so an Antonioni film is like going to film school at the postdoctorate level. And one is astounded at the vivacity of the way in which that cinematographic sequence is able to disclose without mentioning any ideology whatsoever or any doctrine whatsoever. And so the title of our lecture, Sequence Establishes, and Dynamic Vectors Generate Narrative. Because what comes out of that freedom, out of that mobility of the frame, is a transform of language. Now it is not just a rote instruction, but it's able to generate a story, a narrative for the first time. And what becomes apparent is that the carrier of the narrative is the protagonist, the star of the story. What is the story about? Who is it about? What do they do? And so one gains a new quality of experience, an experience that results not in an instructed unit, but as someone who now has a character that is developed by their experience. And so they inhabit their lives to generate experience so that their narrative is richer and their character is more expressed. And so the first time you have the mythic character that will become like the forerunner of the differential person. Differential personality is deeply related to the character. The character who inhabits the experience of that life is like the beginning seed out of which, through several transformations, will come the artistic person, the personality who is not just interested in the protagonist of the story, but is interested also in the writer of the story. And man learns to become the artist of their life and not just the star of their life. Not just build as the person who now inhabits the character around which the richness of the experience can go outside those ritual frames without destroying it, can come back and use it in a different way. Yes, the ritual frames are necessary. That objectivity, those squares, those circles, that geometricity is useful. But its use is not in jumping in and being imprisoned by them, but by utilizing them in various different ways. First of all, to generate the narrative experience of feeling. And when feeling has the capacity for narrative experience, images change. It's no longer things in the world that are objective, statically there, but the images of them in the experience of the character become fluidly there as well. They're not objective as forms, but they're fluidly as real as those objective forms, so that experience now becomes a process that is capable of engendering itself in stories which are expandable, enrichable. And it's out of that expanded, enriched, experiential milieu that a space is made for the very first time. Not a space in the center of any kind of limited shape, but a space that is able to be integrated out of all of the inner freedom that this enriched imaged experience make, and that quality begins to form as the seed of the mind, and it's called the imagination. And the imagination will be as objective as the world. The imagination in the mind creates objectivities that are as permanent as any existentiality in the universe. And so, for the very first time, one begins to have the power of thought to become objective and to have its relationality to the rituals of life, to the objectivity of existence, not on the basis of limitation, but on the basis of being related by an enriched, feeling-toned imagery of experience. And so the character begins to develop all kinds of festooning, to use a Shakespearean term. One wants to now have all the bangles, all the feathers, and all the new musical instruments. We're not just limited to the ritual drum. We can have things like flutes and oboes and tambourines, and now we have a completely different quality to the way in which life is lived. And all of this goes back not just forward into the development of the imagination in the mind, but recursively goes back to ritual and turns ritual into ceremony. So now it is ceremonial. There are many things that one does. We like to have a lot of red at certain times. We like to have a lot of blue at certain times, and it's fine. These are all variants of character-based experience enrichment, and it doesn't destroy the rituals at all. One would not be interested in having Halloween in April, but at the end of October, it's very interesting to have Halloween, black and orange. But in April, let's have something like lavender and lime. It's an enrichment. And what we're looking at is how the Chinese and the Navajo, as a set of examples, got themselves into a hole by engendering incredible amounts of experience and freedom and spaces of imagination, and yet curtailing them again and again because they saw this as very dangerous. And so both the Chinese and the Navajo worlds became very, very brittle. And as soon as the trigger was pulled of a very powerful kind of human character, very powerful kind of mind that came into play with them, that was neither Chinese nor Navajo, both of those societies crumbled, smashed. And it happened in the 1620s. Matteo Ricci and his Jesuit missionaries, when they established themselves in Peking in the early 1600s, changed the entire way in which Chinese life would be lived forever. And at the same time, the plans for an American Indian school by John Amos Comenius with the British thinkers like Hartleb and so forth to establish an Indian college for the first time, and the moves were made to do this outside of Jamestown in 1620. All of a sudden, the American Indians and the Chinese at the very same time were changed forever, because the Europeans, the Germans, the French, the English, the Portuguese, they didn't care at all about the limitations of the Navajo or the Chinese. Let's take a break. Our translation of the Analects of Confucius is by Raymond Dawson. He's a very famous writer on China. He says in his biography of Confucius and the Past Masters series, he says the Jesuit version of Confucian doctrine and of the benevolent despotism, which in their view administered the country in conformity with Confucian doctrine, so aroused the admiration of contemporary European thinkers that Confucius himself has been described as the patron saint of the Enlightenment. On the other hand, the Protestant missionaries who came to China in the 19th century could see little to praise in Confucius since he lacked the light of God. Even James Legge, whose monumental work entitled The Chinese Classics was so authoritative as to have been reprinted on its 100th birthday in the middle of the 20th century, concluded that Confucius threw no new light on any questions that have a worldwide interest. He gave no impulse to religion. He had no sympathy with progress. His influence has been wonderful, but it will henceforth wane. So we in the Western world are heirs to two conflicting attitudes to the Chinese sage. What was a devastating example of mutual transform occurred in the 16th century and came to a head in the early 17th century, about the time that Shakespeare was finishing up his last work, and came to a head in 1623. To understand this, there's a principle in geology whereby a superinfusion of a superior addition to a geologic strata will dominate and change that existing strata, but it itself becomes changed in doing so. There's a mutual exchange of transform, and the conquerors are as changed as the conquered. When the first Europeans, the Spanish under Cortez and the early conquistadors, when they came to the New World, they did not come with anything other than to just take over the gold, get the gold. But they soon found that there was a lot going on in the indoctrinated ritual comportment of the Spanish life. Spain was dominated by Roman Catholicism. And as soon as Cortez demonstrated that one could go to the New World and bring back incredible amounts of gold. In fact, the dollar sign comes from that era. S is for Spain, and the two lines through the dollar sign S are the pillars of Hercules leading back to Spain. Bring the gold in. And so you stamp it with the money sign. It belongs to the Spanish emperor, who is secure in his place because the Spanish church keeps him there. And so right away, following on the heels of the conquistadores, was a new ritual society, the soldiers of Jesus, the Jesuits. And they went with the express purpose everywhere in the world to convert. That means to take over. And they went to the Americas about the same time that they went to China, because the Americas were developed because people were trying to get to China. So the Americas and China are linked together for a long time in historical vision. It's not so far-fetched to use a Navajo and a Chinese as the opening set for ritual comportment. When the Jesuits first went to the Southwest, their emphasis was on the Pueblo peoples, because when they saw how they were set up, they're the ones that had the beautiful mesa cities. They're the ones that seemed to them to have the highest level of civilization, and therefore they must have the key to the control of the gold and the people and everything else. And so the Jesuit incursion on the Pueblo peoples ignored the recent immigrants at that time of the Navajos. And for a number of years, the Jesuit missionaries did their conversion work and their changing of all the rituals until the Pueblo people rose up and killed all the missionaries and threw them out because they had fractured the holy universe of the Pueblo peoples. And it was a while before the church came back, new missionaries, backed this time by military power, and reasserted their control. But the powerful play was not so much by the Spanish. The powerful play was by the British, because it was the nascent growing of the British Empire that even outclassed the Spanish Imperium. And one of the things is that the earliest incursions were indeed after the gold, Sir Walter Raleigh and his quest for El Dorado. But the British Empire was interested in colonizing, in making sure that the land and the people were not just converted to, why would they convert them to Roman Catholicism? They were Protestant. And so the whole thrust changed. In the American Southwest, one had the Spanish. In the Californias, one had the Spanish, the 21 missions on the California coast. But on the East Coast, in Virginia, especially, in Massachusetts especially, all the way down into Georgia, into New York, but it's Virginia and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts that give the strongest array of the clash of ritual worlds. This was not a Roman Catholic Christianity, but a Protestant Christianity that came into play. And that Protestant Christianity was itself split into several different camps. In the Massachusetts colonies, you had the Puritans. In the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area, you had the German Pietists, the Dutch Pietists. In Virginia, you had the British Protestants. And down in Georgia, you had a lot of Scottish rogues who secretly wanted to just control. The difficulty is in understanding that the development of the Americas and the Western incursion into China, both happening about the same time, were concomitant to a deep transform in the ritual comportment of these European countries, especially of Christianity. All the qualities in Christianity were being completely challenged at the time. It isn't Martin Luther so much, but it is what has been called the radical revolution that came on the heels of that. Luther wrote all kinds of volumes and documents. His collected works run to almost 60 volumes. But the scary part for them was not a man leaving the church, leaving his monkhood and getting married and becoming a Protestant, establishing what became Lutheranism. The really scary thing for the powers that were the peasant revolts. Thomas Münster in Germany almost took over a whole section of Germany in the 1520s. And out of this came all kinds of utopian movements to try and redo the ritual comportment of human life by redoing the ritual comportment of Christianity. And one of the great volumes chronicling a great deal of this in the 16th century, the 1500s, The Radical Reformation, George Hunston Williams, published in Philadelphia. The really strong movement, though, is German Pietism. And German Pietism, here German Pietism during the 18th century, published in Leyden. This is the great classic of it, The German Pietists of Provincial Pennsylvania. And it is from the German-Dutch Pietists of Quaker Pennsylvania that Gladys Reichard comes from, and her comportment towards the Navajo Indians is full of all of the complexities of her coming from a radical Protestant revolution that was successful and coming into play when two great, huge changes in the ritual structure were being effected. One, anthropology as a science was coming into play for the very first time. It started with just a couple of indications in the 1860s, but it wasn't until the 1880s that you began to have a concerted effort to begin to understand anthropology as the study of all these peoples, the American Indian peoples of North, Central, and South America, and all the beginnings of the publications covering all of this, the primordial peoples of the New World. And what interested a lot of the descendants of the Protestant radical revolution in places like Massachusetts, Boston, in places like Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, in places like Virginia, was the realization that Christianity and the Protestant mode, it's just LA. Protestant Christianity, in order to assert itself, could not stay on a revision of Roman Catholicism. It had to find a way to have its ritual comportment more primordial than the Roman Catholic. Now, the Roman Catholic ritual comportment was all based on Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul have the keys to heaven. You can't get in unless they let you in. The church has authority based on Peter and Paul. And so the only way to undercut that is to take your ritual comportment back before Peter and Paul. Back to the primordial community before they were called Christians, when they were still Jews, to go back to Jesus. And so one had, especially in the ways in which Massachusetts and Pennsylvania were like two focuses, the Puritan and the Quaker. You had this focus in the Puritan tradition that one had to purify one's life and go back to the beginnings of the way in which Jesus and his community lived before the church was established. one of the great studies that came out, published by the Institute for Early American History and Culture, Williamsburg, Virginia, University of North Carolina Press put this out. It's called, it was put out in 1988, To Live Ancient Lives, the Primitivist Dimension in Puritanism. And that is, people trying to carry their life rituals back to a primordiality. And as they carried themselves back to a primordiality, they went back to try to live as the primitive Christians lived when they were still Jews. And so what developed out of this was a tinge to the ritual comportment, not only of primitive Christianity, but of a Hebraic primitive, pre-Christian community. And so you find this concern. And the center of that concern is to go back to the ritual song cycle that was there in the apex of Judaism and carried all the way and achieved the thrust of that apex in the time of Jesus. And that song cycle is called the Psalms. And so it is the Psalms of David in the Old Testament that becomes the focus of the Hebraic American pre-Christian primitive community. They're not interested in following the Torah of Moses. They're not particularly interested in all the admonitions of the prophets. They were about those people then. But they took the Psalms and reappropriated the Psalms as their ritual comportment for the early Christian community. And so you find that the Psalms become the focus of the whole ritual comportment. People carried the psalmody, the Psalms with them. They didn't carry so much the Bible, but the Psalms. Before Shakespeare wrote, the most powerful English poetic voice was Sir Philip Sidney. And had Sir Philip Sidney not been killed in a battle in the Netherlands before he was 40 years of age, he would have probably held the place of almost Shakespeare. And the young genius of Sir Philip Sidney was focused on two projects. One was called Arcadia, going back to the primordial landscape of the world for encouragement, going back to nature itself for encouragement of the broad vision of the universe, and the Psalms of David. He spent many years perfecting his translation of the Psalms of David. And it's because of the success of Sir Philip Sidney making the Psalms of David into Elizabethan English that the whole program of translating the entire Bible into Elizabethan English was promulgated in the first place. And it's called the King James Version because it came out in 1611 when King James was the head, but it was developed in Elizabethan times, Elizabethan England, the times of Sir Philip Sidney and his great friend Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Faerie Queene, and of the young Shakespeare, and of Philip Marlowe, of the great age when the English language changed. It changed from the Middle English of the character humanity of Chaucer to the universal humanity of the Shakespearean ethos, of the Sir Philip Sidney Psalms ethos. And so one began to find that their comportment about the time of Shakespeare was to carry this transformative language, not to convert the Indians of the New World into Roman Catholicism on the basis of Peter and Paul's Roman Catholic Christianity, but to go and educate the Indians to a new universal dynamic quality of English language, a new vision of the primordiality, and to bring them into the fold in this way. They would enter through a door that was there before Peter and Paul seeded the Roman Catholic Church structure. And so one would do an end run around the whole idea of the Jesuits, the Roman Catholic Church, all of this. What happened was that they found in the early 1600s one of the great geniuses in world history, the man who reformed education. His name was John Amos Comenius. This is a volume put out by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational. This was put out for the 300th anniversary of the publication of his great educational program. And it has a foreword by Jean Piaget. And in it, Piaget concludes, he says, from this point of view, 300 years later, it matters little whether the genetic conception of education propounded by Comenius and his ideas on mental development were drawn from Neoplatonic theories about the return of beings or derived from some other philosophical source. The important thing is that by placing this recension at the level of human activity and in parallel with the formative processes of nature, he created a series of new problems for his century: mental development, the psychological basis of teaching methods, the relationship between school and society, the need to organize or relegate and regulate syllabuses and administrative organization of education, to have realized that such problems exist and to have lost no opportunity of drawing attention to their vital importance for the future of mankind, is the greatest claim to fame of the celebrated educationalists in honor of whom UNESCO is publishing this commemorative work. Before his educational program, and the reason why he was invited everywhere in Europe to design these programs, whether it's in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, or in London, or in Stockholm, or in Paris, he was invited everywhere, and his basic work began in England when he was invited there by a group of people, Samuel Hartley and his crowd, and they wanted to take the cream of the new transformed utopian qualities and bring them into play in the New World. And so Comenius was asked to design a college for the American Indians. Here, Comenius in England, the visit of John Amos Comenius, the Czech philosopher and educationist, to London, 1641-42, its bearing on the origins of the Royal Society. One of the things that came out of this was the surfacing of a secret group that was called the Invisible College, that met invisibly because the great Protestant Revolution in England at the time had killed the King Charles I and had subjected all of the rituals in England to the scrutiny of radical, militant, Protestant people who pulled down all of the monasteries. Glastonbury Cathedral was ruined by them. They wanted to get rid of all of the popishness forever and to stamp it out by destroying all the stuff, killing the people, and especially getting rid of the king and just having a process of authoritative oligarchic elders that were committed to this new religion. So here is the bearings on the development of the Royal Society. One of the qualities was that when you bring it public, science now becomes a different kind of a function. It becomes the dynamic maturity of the ritual transform that happens, so that the experience that one had that was freed up to be imaginative now is given an additional dimension, that it's not just experience that is imaginative, but it is experiment that becomes imaginative, as that movable ritual frame that we talked about, like Antonioni, that you now are able to take a ritual comportment as a frame of reference and move it around in terms of a planned experiment to see what kind of experience comes out of that. And this leads, where the experience leads to art, the experiment leads to science. And so Comenius is one of the great figures in world history. He not only makes the trigger that has the Royal Society, but also makes the trigger of the development of the encyclopedia. The whole idea that there should be an encyclopedia of the entire world and all of its contents, all of its traditions, comes from him. The French picked up on that, as well as the British. And on plans for the higher education of the Indians of New England and Virginia. Now, in 1607, they had set 15,000 acres aside outside of Jamestown on that peninsula of Virginia to be the site of a massive New World utopian educational experiment. And by 1622, a huge amount of money was made available. A director was sent over to start it, and a whole number of adjunct colonists were sent. The difficulty is that by 1622, the report from the Pueblo people of massacring and getting rid of the Roman Catholic Jesuit conquistadors out of the American Southwest report had reached Virginia, the Atlantic coast. And so the director of the would-be Indian Institute was murdered. 340 colonists were murdered and massacred. And for the rest of the 1600s, nobody did anything about the projected college for the American Indians. All of this happened at the very same time, almost the same year that the Jesuits went into China en masse. They went into Beijing, and they curried favor with the emperor. They also went into Japan about that same time. The James Clavell's Shogun is a series done around the Jesuits going into Japan. But it was China that was the big prize. China is 10 times what Japan is minimally. The Chinese had had a long history of dynasties that some had favored Confucian development, some had favored a Taoist, some had favored a Buddhist, but all three of those were knit together under a new form of Confucianism called Neo-Confucianism in the Qing Dynasty. But the Qing Dynasty fell to the Mongols, and for about 150 years, the Mongols, Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, the Khans ran China. But as soon as the Chinese got back into power, threw the Mongols out, that dynasty was called the Ming. The Ming in Chinese means really bright, big time. And the Ming brought in a new form, a super sonic quality of Neo-Confucianism, and the great figure there is Wang Yang-ming, of energizing the Neo-Confucian of the Qing revised version of the old original Han dynasty Confucianism, so that all of a sudden you had a completely learned kind of equality where the entire society was run on the basis of intellectual refinement, scholar, bureaucrats, all trained the same way. And because the entire ritual comportment of the Chinese people was all based on a pyramid structure going to the top, only the top little parfait, those who had access to the emperor at his court, would be able to be refined enough to be able to read, to be able to understand, to have the education, the background. And so a very, very small fraction of the Chinese people were literate. In fact, the literate people were referred to and should be referred to as the literati. They're the only ones that could read. The only ones who could understand why it is that we do this and what the wisdom is. And so the Jesuits, when they came in, they were very heavily schooled in exactly the same way. All they had to do was learn Chinese because they had the same kind of a comportment. Because the papacy had arranged itself for centuries, just like the Confucians, around the power structure that runs things, religion and politics. And so one finds that as soon as the Jesuits learned enough Chinese and learned how to play those games, it only took them about 20 years. The Ming Dynasty fell. And they brought in a new dynasty called the Qing. And the Qing Dynasty were not Chinese, and they weren't Mongols, but they were Manchus. They were from Manchuria. Manchus from Manchuria. They were the very rich, powerful northern peoples who always were on the outside of classic China. They were not from the Yangtze Valley. They were not from the Huanghe Valley. They were not from the West. They were not from the characteristic power kingdoms even in the South. They were from Manchuria, and they were like semi-Koreans. They had always been on the outside, now they were in. And so the Manchu used a Jesuit Neo-Confucianism to set itself up in a completely new way. And out of this came the development of the parfait of ritual levels that led increasingly to an impossible brittleness in the Chinese world. When it became evident that China was completely helpless in the 1840s. It was called the Opium War. The British especially, but all the other European powers as well, were introducing opium into China, getting people on the tie line, opening opium dens everywhere. And the port commissioner in Canton, in the south of China, Commissioner Lin, decided that this was corrupting the Chinese people permanently. They're going to become all drug addicts. And so he fought the British, and of course the British were militarily much too strong, and they took over. And as they took over, opium laced Chinese society, and especially those who were educated or slightly more courageous to be disenfranchised. Not so much the peasants who were buried in the ritual comportment, but anybody who was the least little bit creative tended to become effete and an addict, much the same way that the United States has gone. And so one found that by 1900, the Chinese situation was crucial. All of the great treaty ports were now fortresses of a drug-dealing military incursion of European countries, and the response was the Boxer Rebellion. The film 55 Days in Beijing tells one little episode of that Boxer Rebellion. A very similar thing had happened to the American Indians. Reservation after reservation was established, ritually limiting them so that they were only able to function on such and such a land on such and such terms. And the incursions kept coming, shrinking that, undermining that. And so one had a situation where the ritual comportment of the modern world looks like a crackle finish. It's like that ceramic ware that has the crackle. Underneath a superficial gloss that's supposed to make it look nice, the entire planet is completely fractured. There is not one single tradition that is whole any longer on this planet. And so we need to do what people have always done. We have to go back to a primordiality. But we can't go back to a primordiality of even a Jesus or even a Buddha or even a Pythagoras. We have to go back to the primordiality, which is nature. The zero openness, the infinite openness of nature, and reemerge fresh out of that, because that emergence will always be whole. It's one of the qualities that's there. The second most popular book in the American colonial experience after the Bible was Comenius's book called The Labyrinth of the World and the Paradise of the Heart. It was owned by more people in America, in what became the United States, than any other book outside of the Bible. And they were always reading it, and reading it out loud. And in it, Comenius says, it's almost like a Pilgrim's Progress, only much deeper, much wider. He says, after much inward struggle and turning the matter over in my mind, I came to the decision that I should first look into all human affairs under the sun, and then, only having wisely compared one with another, choose a vocation and arrange for myself the things necessary for leading a peaceful life in the world. The longer I thought of this plan, the better I liked it. And then, chapter 2, the pilgrim obtains ubiquitous as his guide. A spirit helper comes to him and says, you cannot expect to do this alone, on your own. He says, many times in the world, people have had to do this, but they were more simpler times. But it was mere child's play compared to the way in which the labyrinth of this world now is fashioned. Particularly in our own day, I, a man of experience, do not counsel thee to enter it alone. But where shall I seek such a guide? And he says, I am sent as your guide, and I shall lead thee to many secret places whereto thou wouldst never have found your way. And so the labyrinth of the world and the paradise of the heart seeded, especially rural eastern Pennsylvania, where the most powerful and enduring of those communities were there. And that's where Gladys Reichert came from. So when she went to the Navajo people, she went as someone who had layer after layer after layer of openness, of shareability. She not only knew how to write anthropological monographs, she learned how to weave her own Navajo rugs just like a Navajo woman would. She spoke their language just like they did, and she was able to live just like they did. She became Navajo. More next week.